there's another element to this. There's another side to this, and I think for
Mhm.
a lot of Westerners, they're like, oh well, this guy sucks, so the other guys probably they're the good guys, right? That's
Mhm.
how I've been asked. Like I've been asked multiple times, who's the good guys? Can you talk about the Sudanese military for a bit and their leadership? The reason I have you here today, and I really appreciate you coming on, is because I wanted to talk to you about Sudan, because there's not a lot of content on Twitch, particularly talking about this issue. I remember back in 2019, I talked to members, I even interviewed some members of the Sudanese diaspora during the democracy protests that were going on at the time. Everybody was putting blue in their profile images, but then after the blue faded, everybody kind of just forgot Sudan existed or what the movement was about. And as that pro-democracy movement kind of started to fall apart, and as there was crackdowns by the RSF, and then led to eventually what we have today. And so before we get into any of that, could you please introduce yourself? I would really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on, of course, Dylan. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Qasim. I was born and raised in Sudan. I did my undergrad in Sudan, but I haven't quite been based in Sudan for the last maybe 4 or 5 years, because I went abroad to do my graduate degrees. But while I was there, I also worked for like one of the prominent think tanks for a couple of years. And I'm very well acquainted with a lot of the activism work and like the political landscape in Sudan. And yeah, mainly here to, as you said, kind of discuss. And I'll just say, I think a big part of the reason is kind of under the radar is Sudan is a mostly Arabic-speaking country. So on Twitter right now, you'll see a lot about Sudan, just mostly not in English, which makes it harder for non-Arabic speakers to kind of figure out what's going on.
Yeah, before we get into the specifics, did you see the fake RSF Twitter account that was going everywhere? I remember tweeting at it at the time. That was like after Twitter made it so you could basically buy a blue check mark. Somebody bought a blue check mark, made an RSF account, and started being like Hetmente has died. We give up, we surrender.
Yeah,
They were
yeah.
like hardcore trolling. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, no, I did not see it. I heard about it. It was like making the rounds on like what's up on Facebook, but I did not see the actual Twitter. But yes, I think everyone was kind of familiar with it.
Okay, so before we get into what's going on right now, I want to talk about what was happening in Sudan 2019. There was a pro-democracy movement, the regime of Omar al-Bashir, which engaged in the Darfur genocide, which just like quick, I know there's a lot of history to go into here.
Yes.
A quick rundown of that would also be appreciated. Can you tell me about that movement, about the Blue for Sudan movement?
Yeah, so I'll try to give like a 1 or 2 minute summary. So actually, the democracy movement in Sudan started before 2019. I think it first started in 2013 when protests actually kind of started building up. But there was a very strong crackdown by Bashir's government. They actually killed maybe 200 people in like a couple of days, like peaceful protesters. And that completely kind of shut down protests for at least a few more years. But then it started picking up steam again in around 2016, 2017. And that's what kind of gave birth to the blue profile that you're talking about. Eventually in 2019, the economic situation started to go south and people were kind of restless. And it really sparked off. So late 2019 is when the protests really kind of sparked up. Actually, it was 2018, sorry. And then in 2019, there was the proper revolution and the army took over in like the 6th of April. And then there was a change in government. And so basically after the 6th of April, this was 2019, we got like a joint government between the military, which had taken over power and kind of overthrew Omar Bashir, and the civilians, represented by the Forces of Freedom and Change mainly, which is like a coalition of opposition parties during the old regime. They decided on a power sharing agreement where they would rule through basically or govern a transitional period of 3 years. But unfortunately, after a year and a half, the tensions between the military and the opposition parties kind of also escalated, and the military did basically a soft coup. And I say a soft coup, it was actually a coup, but a soft coup because they were kind of already in power. They're sharing power with the civilian. So they just basically kicked them all out and consolidated their own power and decided like, okay, we're just going to take over from here. And this is when the tensions kind of started to build up with the rapid support forces. So the rapid support forces were kind of on the military side. At that point, it was.
But now, before we stop here for a second, it might be kind of hard for a lot of people because in most countries there's a military and that's it, right? But in Sudan, that's not the case. There's the rapid support forces, which came from the Janjaweed. Could you talk a little bit about that history?
Yes, so yes, we do need to get into the history of the RSF. The rapid support forces, I'll refer to them as the RSF because that's much faster. So, as you mentioned, the RSF have their history started off in the war in Darfur, where Bashir's government basically armed a specific tribe to fight against the rebels for them, and over time they kind of grew in power and numbers, and eventually he decided to kind of try to incorporate them into the formal structure of the government, but instead of incorporating them into the military, he made them report directly to him, the old president Omar Bashir. They reported directly to him as a kind of parallel military. And he used them specifically to kind of fight wars, proxy wars. For example, they fought in Yemen, they fought in Libya, and mostly he actually used them as a backup because he was starting to feel, I think, unrest from the military. So having them report directly to him kind of gave him like that, let's say, safety, because he thought they would kind of protect him and make sure the military does not perform any coups against him. But eventually, when he was overthrown, he actually called them into Khartoum. They were not based in Khartoum, but he called them into Khartoum in 2018 as the protests got harder because he thought they would help crack down on the protests in 2019. But they had apparently reached an agreement with the military and other regional powers. So it's like, okay, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to crack down. And it's time for Bashir to go. And that's what happened. But since they were there, in part of that agreement, they kind of also took part in the transitional period. They were still a parallel military there, but they were part of the military council. So that's Hemeti, yes, correct. So Hemeti is the leader of the Janjaweed or the RSF now. So they went from being a militia to being an organized force that's actually part of the structure of the state.
I do want to quickly say though, when we say organized, we're using this term very loosely because they don't really their military discipline isn't exactly great. They've been accused of tons and tons and tons of war crimes, and not only Darfur but across the region. How would you classify them? Would you classify them as basically like a militia? Because they're certainly not like we would say like a Western style military force. How would you like classify them? How they behave and how they act?
Sure, it's a bit complex actually. I would definitely say they were militia, and now they're maybe a pseudo militia because in the 3 years basically of the transitional period, they actually put a lot of their officers went through the military academy. You can see pictures of RSF members graduating from the military academy with the general of the army, like the head of the military, there to witness their graduation. So they tried. I think he decided that being a militia is not good for his ambitions, like Hemeti, and the only way for him to actually kind of go further than where he was at was to organize his militia into a proper force. But at the same time, a lot of the old recruits and a lot of the new recruits, he recruited a lot of young people from marginalized backgrounds, did not give them proper training discipline. They do not have the same kind of laws and discipline, like you said. So even as recently as 2019, after the revolution, there was a sit-in basically at the military headquarters, and the RSF cracked down hard on that sit-in. They killed hundreds of people in one day, actually one morning. There was a lot of rape, a lot of torture that all happened in basically a couple of days. And even today, he claimed, I think he was on TV today saying that a lot of his members are acting on their own, and because they're been seen looting and destroying property, so they kind of are out of control. So it's kind of hard to say whether they're a militia or an army, but they're definitely somewhere in between that, or like an organized force. Because
like a
on the
paramilitary
other
force
hand,
of some capacity.
yes, they are. Yes, because on the other hand, I've known people, like I've spoken to, let's say, officials from other countries during the transitional period, where they would sit with the Sudanese military, they would sit with the RSF, and say the RSF has much more organized. And I think that's mainly due to the fact that the RSF has its own resources. They basically they own and operate gold mines in Sudan. When Sudan at the moment, it used to be oil, like the main export, but now it's gold. So they control a lot of gold export in black market and the formal market. So they have lots of resources. They hire external firms. They have a Canadian actually firm, I think, that does PR for them, and they have good relations with Russia. And all of this, they have, I think, 12 forums on the Twitter.
I've heard there were some accusations that Russia might actually be supplying them with weapons. I know CNN produced a report documenting Russian transport planes heading over to Libya that could have possibly be transporting weapons to them.
So yes, in the past, I think it's documented that in the past, definitely, Russia did support them with weapons, especially through Libya, because they did fight for Russian interests in Libya. But at the moment, there have been planes that came from Libya when this conflict started. But the Wagner group, which basically operates in Libya, claimed it was just like aid and whatnot. Obviously, it's hard to tell anything. One of the big issues right now for the last 2 weeks is there's this big fog of war in all media. We don't know what's happening. The RSF claims they control some places. The military claims they control other places, and it's really hard for anyone to tell what's true or what's false.
So, I want to talk a little bit about the guy on screen right here. This guy who I'm gonna say not the nicest guy. Okay, could be a nicer guy. He used to back up Omar al-Bashir, but eventually he actually was part of his downfall. And ever since then, he has been largely described from the conversations I've had with people as somebody who's climbing the power ladder, somebody who's very ambitious, and it just keeps on climbing. He's extremely power hungry. Was this an accurate description of the man? How would you talk about this man? How would you describe him?
Yeah, that is 100% correct. So obviously, based on his history, his morality and ethics are very dubious and suspect. But what's not suspect is I'd say his charisma. He's quite a charismatic guy and super ambitious, very obviously. Like, for example, I think they had maybe 30,000, he had 30,000 people in his paramilitary force when the revolution started at the beginning of this transitional period. But now they're up to 100,000. They're almost actually as large as the army, because I think the Sudanese army is like maybe 150,000. Obviously, they have other advantages like Air Force and like Navy and whatnot, which the RSF does not have. But in terms of like ground forces, they have grown, and they've been and he's been kind of making regional connections, like with the UAE, because he fought in the Yemen war. He's also got lots of strong relations with Chad, the Central African Republic. So he's been spreading his influence, obviously, in a bid to kind of position himself to kind of basically rule Sudan in the future.
So that's the RSF. They're making the jump for power, but there's another element to this. There's another side to this, and I think for a lot of Westerners, they're like, oh well, this guy sucks, so the other guys probably they're the good guys, right? That's how I've been asked. Like, I've been asked multiple times, who's the good guys? Can you talk about the Sudanese military for a bit and their leadership?
Yeah, so the Sudanese military is more complicated because the Sudanese military as an institution is kind of old. It's been there since we got our independence, basically in '56. But it's been a vehicle kind of for undemocratic rule in Sudan ever since Sudan was conceived. Because we've had like democracy followed by military coup, democracy followed by military coup. The cycle of democracies and coups has been going on since 1956. So the current general of Burhan, he took over actually not after al-Bashir, because when al-Bashir fell, there was a interim kind of general who basically lasted for a day. He announced that he threw over a Bashir and he took power, but people protested him. And then a Burhan came forward, and he basically took up the next day as head of the army and as such head of the country, basically, and the transitional council. And the military, like I said, it's hard to describe. It's definitely not. It's more institutional than, let's say, the RSF. It's not a militia, but at the same time, it's fought most of its wars in Sudan. Like most of the military's efforts have been to fight, civil wars and quench rebellions in Sudan. So it's not got the best rep. But when people went to during the revolution, they went to petition the military to stand with them, and the military, at least some of them, I'll grant that most of the military did not do much, but some military officers actually disobeyed direct commands to not help the protesters. But a lot of the officers protected the protesters from pro-government armed thugs, basically, that came in every night to attack the protesters and kill them. So it's kind of a mix when it comes to the military, and they also have a bad reputation in Darfur because yes, the Janjaweed did a lot of atrocities, but obviously the military had a part in that as well. Also in South Sudan, and they're not super democratic either. Like right now, it's kind of interesting because both parties are claiming that they're fighting for democratic rule. Also, it's quite obvious, I guess, for anyone that neither of them is super interested in democracy. But yes, that's generally how it positions the military at the moment.
So the read I've gotten from the situation is that both of these sides suck. Neither of them truly care about democracy. Both of them have been involved in multiple human rights abuses, war crimes, especially in Darfur. But the read I'm getting from my Sudanese friends is that people generally kind of just wish the military comes out on top here because people just seem to be more scared of the RSF due to their conduct during the current fighting and the way they have historically behaved. And because Hemedti is a power-hungry maniac.
Yes. No, that's 100% correct. So you have, I would say, the people on the streets definitely support the military. They feel much safer with the military. The military isn't going around looting people and killing people at random. Well, I guess there have been some casualties, collateral damage from the bombings, which people are not happy about. But for the most part, if you see a military vehicle, you will not feel unsafe. That cannot be said for the RSF. Lots of stories of like looting and burning and killing coming in. The RSF denies that this is them. They say it's either random elements that are going rogue or not them, blaming it on the old regime. They say the old regime is trying to stoke the flames of war so they can come back in power, so they claim all of that is...
What does that even mean? Like they're in, like somebody's dressing up like the RSF and going and doing... Really?
Yes, that's their claim, yes. And it's not as if it's never happened before, like the old regime, because they kind of had basic access to everything. They have military uniforms, RSF uniforms, police uniforms, anything you can think of. So it's not out of the realms of possibility that some of this happened, especially initially. But for the most part, these people would not have like the RSF vehicles with the RSF license plates, which we see doing or conducting a lot of these random acts of violence. So yeah, I'm not sure how. I also
feel like there's a lot going on right now for the military to be preoccupied with playing dress up. It feels like
it's not the military. So here is how the power structure, I would say, in Sudan is. It's not the military. So the military right now is its own entity. Then there is the old regime, which is a pseudo-political but also armed kind of entity, because they had their own armed forces. Like I said, they used to attack the protesters in the middle of the night because they had basically their also kind of own militia. It was a party militia as opposed to like a tribal or family militia like the RSF.
Mm-hmm. So this would be like if the Democratic Party had like a gang or something. Like they had their own militia.
Basically that. Absolutely that.
Yes. I'd be part of Dark Brandon's brigade. Continue.
Yeah. So this is who the RSF is blaming. Then you have the rebel forces or previous rebels, like from different regions of Sudan. They're currently in Khartoum. And here is, I think, what's actually very interesting and unique about the Sudan conflict. A third of the population of Sudan actually lives in Khartoum, like it's like 40 million people. And all of the war is basically happening in Sudan because in Khartoum, because most of the RSF forces were in Khartoum because they were part of like the structure of the transitional power. The rebel forces are in Khartoum because they did the peace deal and they all moved to Khartoum, and the military is in Khartoum. So this third of the population, this landmass that contains third of the population and also runs basically the entire country, is now under a very weird situation. Like half of it is controlled by RSF. I'm not sure about the proportion, but portions of it are controlled by RSF, portions of it are controlled by the army, which I think is a kind of unique situation because mostly you'd have, even if you have civil war, it would be like regions fighting against each other. It wouldn't be like once people in the same city kind of fighting for the capital at the same time. So yes, it's a kind of interesting situation to be in.
So I have a few more questions, but I'm going to say, chat, if you have any questions, now would be the time. He doesn't have a tremendously long period of time, so I don't want to keep him too long here. Corey Posting, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub. I have to ask. So now that we see the ceasefire developing, but I put ceasefire in like massive air quotes because it's a ceasefire, but fighting still continues. Not surprising considering like a lot of these people don't have a lot of discipline when it comes to, following exact orders. They might follow general orders like take a city, but how they take the city, they'll take some liberties. Is there any hope for a cessation of the violence anytime soon?
I don't think anytime soon, because even these ceasefires that they keep announcing are meaningless. they have literally no bearing. For a proper ceasefire to happen, I think they would have to agree to start sitting on a table negotiating. And while they're working towards that, neither side has actually agreed to do that quite yet. I know the US is trying to negotiate or like convince people to do some negotiations in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh. That's like the big push right now, but I don't think either side has kind of 100% agreed on that to this moment up until now. So if that happens, maybe they can reach a proper ceasefire. But without that happening, I don't see a ceasefire happening.
Is there any motivations for them to do that?
Well, for the military, the motivation is the people are suffering. They can't actually win directly because their main advantage, like I said, is Air Force, but they cannot bomb Khartoum. This is why I said like it's an interesting situation. They can't actually bomb Khartoum, their capital. And the RSF is kind of spread out among like civilians and different neighborhoods and so on. So their interest is to kind of just stop the war, try and recover the economy. So to
be clear, is the RSF purposely using civilians as kind of like human shields?
It's hard to say no. They haven't said that, and they're not like holding people except in one neighborhood. That's a military neighborhood where they actually held the military and their families kind of in place. They kind of took him as prisoners. But I heard there was a prisoner exchange and they sorted that out. But for the most part, it's hard to say yes, they're intentionally doing it. But at the same time, come on, you're going to people's houses, you're going to hospitals, you're kind of just spread around random locations, like not strategic locations. So it seems like yes, that is the what they're doing.
So I know that there's very complicated, there's a lot of moving parts here, but do we have any idea on how this is panning out? Because I mean, I would have assumed that, a standardized, institutional military would be able to beat out a paramilitary force. I mean, you see like 100,000 here, 100,000 there, and you'd assume that the force with the Air Force and the more institutional, just like history in the country, that they would come out on top here. But that doesn't seem to necessarily be the case. How's this panning out?
Yeah, so this is what people have been banking on for a while now. Like the RSF, ever since they made it into Khartoum, have been kind of sore in the transition. And I hear lots of people who aren't super familiar with how wars and battles work. They're like, yes, the military with their like tanks and airplanes can wipe out the RSF in like 2 days. And we've been hearing that since the beginning of this conflict. Is like, yes, it's just going to be another day. And obviously that's not the case, and it's not going to be the case anytime soon, because like battles in cities, especially like cities in Khartoum, is not kind of the same as, I don't know, regional battles or whatever. So at the moment, what the military is trying to do, I guess, is try to starve out the RSF, because they have the Air Force. They can make sure that the RSF is not able to bring in reinforcements from other regions. They cannot bring in like extra supplies or ammunition or whatever it is. So trying to just contain them in Khartoum and make sure they kind of tire out, because they have to be at alert all the time. How that will pan out, it's hard to say, because, like I said, Khartoum is quite big. There's plenty of food and water to be had. In terms of weaponry, I'm sure they've stockpiled insane amounts of weaponry and ammunition there. Not to mention, the RSF is a very, rapid support forces. So they're very proud of the rapid part. They move quickly. They have very mobile units. They are actually veterans, because, like I said, they fought in Darfur, they fought in Yemen, they fought in Libya. So they move very quickly and rapidly, and they can make kind of small wins. For example, I think last week they went into the military manufacturing industry or complex in Khartoum, and I'm pretty sure they probably restocked during that raid. So it's hard to tell how long they can last under this current kind of context.
Okay, I've got a few questions from chat.
Sure.
How do the regional players, we're talking Egypt, Saudi Arabia, of course we talked about the Russians, which they're not a regional player, but they are involved. What are they choosing sides? What are they doing? Who are they backing? How are they involved?
So at the moment, no one's backing any sides. Everyone's trying to play diplomatic, and they're trying to say just they have to reach a ceasefire and negotiate a deal. But it's known basically that Egypt sympathizes more with the military, because the Egypt's military and Sudan's military have a long history. So
is this
Egypt
also why those 29, I believe it was 29 Egyptian soldiers were captured by the RSF early in the conflict?
Yes, correct. So they were in the Marawi airport, which is like a military air base. And because the RSF is afraid of airstrikes, and they knew that the Egyptian military is training and developing air capacity for the Sudanese military, the first, actually, this is when the tension started, is when the RSF went to the Marawi military air base and surrounded it to neutralize the Air Force. And that was where initially a lot of the fighting started. So yes, the military and the Sudan armed forces, or the Egyptian military Sudan armed forces, have good relationships. UAE is known to support RSF, because a lot of the gold that the RSF kind of smuggles out goes through the UAE, and they help them obviously in the Yemen war a lot. So they have very strong ties. Russia is also I think Russia is fine with either the military or the RSF. I don't think they care which side, because I think they're cozy with both of them.
Yeah, this is what confused me, because I posted about the CNN article about, it possibly being weapons, and one of the comments I got at the time was, why would they even pick a side at this point? They don't know how this is going to pan out. Why not watch this from a distance? And I really kind of sat on that comment for a bit, and as more time passed, I was like, actually, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Why would they get involved this early on, unless there was some deal made behind closed doors? I know that Russia's very interested in Sudanese gold.
Yeah, and they're also interested in a military base, I think, off the coast of Sudan, which is something they agreed upon a long while ago, I think, as the old government, but now it's kind of shaky. But it's one of the things I know that's being discussed. So Russia, yes, does a lot of gold mining in Sudan as well. And the Wagner Group I mentioned earlier, I think they've been helping the RSF in terms of mining gold in various regions of Sudan. So they have, I think, gold connections, in terms of economics with RSF, but they also need to keep the military happy, because they do have other plans, I guess, for Sudan in terms of the military base and so on.
So 1 second, I'm looking at other questions in chat.
Sure.
Somebody asked for more detail about the sit-in that you mentioned earlier.
Yes. So how the revolution happened was people started off just going on the street and protesting. But eventually, there was a big sit-in right outside the military headquarters in the center of Khartoum. So, like a whole block, maybe multiple blocks of like Khartoum were just covered by people. There was a big sit-in. People brought their tents and their sleeping bags, and they were there for, I guess, maybe over a month. Yeah, definitely over a month. And once the revolution happened, they were still insisting, like the sit-in was still ongoing because they wanted to make sure that the military doesn't just, change faces. They just threw out a Bashir and they bring a new like autocrat. So they decided they will just stay until they make sure there is like proper transition to like civilian government. But after a while, the military got restless from having the sit-in right there. It obviously was right outside the door. They were not very happy with it. So there was an agreement between the various parts of the military council that the sit-in has to go. And how that happened was they just kind of surprised them one morning during was it the last day of Ramadan? Yeah, I think it was the last day of Ramadan. They basically just surprised them in 2019, very early in the morning, and the military forces were told not to interfere at all. So they withdrew all of their forces inside the base, and everyone was standing outside. And then the RSF and various other armed forces just came and plowed through the protesters, killed tons, arrested tons. There was like torture and rape and murder. It was quite bad. A lot of people lost their lives that day. People are still traumatized by it to this day. And it's actually one of the military's biggest shame to this day. And it's one of the reasons people do not trust the military is because of what happened during that sit-in.
I get in a question specifically about Ethiopia and what Ethiopia's view of this conflict is.
Ethiopia, I guess, is also kind of like Russia, where they're not sure, they don't really care because they don't care for the RSF, but they're not happy with the military because the military again sides with Egypt, and one of the big regional issues for Ethiopia at the moment is the new dam they're trying to build, and which Egypt is objecting to. So if the Sudan basically sides with Egypt, it will cause problems with Ethiopia. So that's Ethiopia's main concern. I don't think it really cares about sides. It mainly cares about their own interests, specifically in their own development. And I think the civilians in Sudan are very much in favor of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is also in favor of civilian rule because they helped negotiate the transition, basically. Their prime minister helped negotiate the transition in Sudan. I think he got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. So between civilians and Ethiopia, it's good, but the military is a bit of tension due to the whole relationship with Egypt.
One last question before I ask you to plug yourself where people can find you.
Sure.
Khalifa Haftar, warlord in Libya. For those of you who don't know, he rules a lot of eastern Libya. He tried to take the internationally recognized capital, internationally backed, UN-backed government a few years ago. He failed. He's been engaged in a lot of mass killings. There's been some mass graves uncovered from his crimes. Used to actually be a semi-ally of the United States when he was considering turning on Gaddafi. But I wanted to ask if he has any involvement in this, what his view of this would be, considering that he is also in deep ties with the Wagner Group as well.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about him personally, but like you said, it's a proxy to the Wagner Group because the Wagner Group is operating out of Libya, and they're definitely more in favor of the RSF. They are supporting the RSF directly and indirectly. Haftar in particular, I'm not sure if he's concerned about that. It would probably be great for him if the RSF end up victorious and manage to expand their influence in Sudan, because they would support his efforts in Libya for sure. But I'm not sure if he's too busy with what's happening in Libya to be concerned, because I haven't seen him like on news reports. He hasn't made any particular statements. So I can't really say for sure.
Thank you very much. I see a lot of people in chat thanking you for coming by, saying that they learned a lot, and I'm happy to see that because there's not a ton of attention towards this issue on Twitch. So I really appreciate you coming on today. Where can people find you? Do you have a Twitter account? Do you have anything people can go follow and support you on?
Not really. I'm not really on social media, but if anyone wants to chat or learn more, I'm on Counterpoint server as an admin. I'm there all the time and quite active. So they can feel
Counterpoints
free
was
to
actually,
just-
for anybody curious, Counterpoints was actually my connect here. He just randomly messaged me like, "Hey Dylan, I know that you wanted to talk about Sudan. I got this contact for you," and it was perfect, aligned perfectly.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It's good to kind of spread the word out. Hopefully, international people, the more people know about what's happening, there will be more like international effort to get Sudan on track to, be stabilized as a, because it's a very, let's say, a sensitive time in Sudan's history. So
Absolutely.
hopefully things will go well. Mhm.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having
You have a
me.
good night, okay? I'm
Yeah.
sorry I kept you so long.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's all good. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Of course. Bye-bye. It was great. That was fantastic.